Hello and welcome to another video and podcast from FantasyFootballScout.co.uk. My name is David and today I am joined once again by Aaron to discuss another round of UCL Fantasy. That's right, the international break is completely over now because not only have we got Premier League back on our screens on Tuesday, we are going to have the return of the Champions League, which brings, of course, the fantasy game along with it, which we also cover here at Fantasy Football Scout. And Aaron is in the house. It's going to help us pick the best players for match day 3. How you doing, Aaron? Have you enjoyed the international break, or was it a bit of a drag?
A bit of a drag, to be honest. So, a bit of background: my family is all Irish, so my kind of allegiance to international football is with the Republic of Ireland. We're not very good at the moment, and so it's yeah, it's nice to support a team that loses every once in a while. Seeing like Newcastle don't anymore.
Perfectly balanced as all things should be. Your club team's doing very well, but your nation not so much. And I'm going to imagine that the rugby also was not particularly enjoyable for people from your part of the world, as it also was not enjoyable from people who are from England as well. We both know what it feels like to lose in heart-wrenching fashion as well. So the international break really just brought all sorts of negative emotions, regardless of the sport, to be honest, right?
Yeah, it was a dark time. Thank you for bringing it back
Yes, sorry, man. I'm trying to. I'm just trying to deal with the exit from the Rugby World Cup in the best way I know how, which is to confront it head on. I've realised that maybe not everybody takes the same approach. So with that, let's move swiftly away from the Rugby World Cup and get back to what everyone watching this video really wants to hear about, which is of course UCL Fantasy. Now, before we go any further, of course, this isn't the only piece of UCL Fantasy content that we have on Fantasy Football Scout. We also have the UCL Fantasy Pod, which you can get access to on whichever of the podcast platforms it is that you subscribe to Fantasy Football Community on, and of course you can get even more detail than we have here. This video is obviously on our main channels, just the normal Fantasy Football Scout stuff, so we try and keep this as light as possible, perhaps maybe for those of you who are new to the game, and if you want even more detail, then don't worry, we've got that option as well. So go and follow UCL Fantasy Podcast on X at Fantasy UCL Pod, and of course subscribe to that pod on whichever of the podcast platforms it is that you use. Now, it will probably feel like ages ago now, Aaron, but there was match day 2, I think a couple of weeks ago now. So I thought we'd start off with how you got on in that particular game. There was lots of talk around which chips to use, or whether or not to use a chip, for example. So where did you end up settling in that, and how did the game week go?
So I ended up, I think the key word is surviving because I feel like I was one of the few people who didn't play their limitless chip and it worked. I ended up getting similar scores to people and I had a slight red arrow, which was expected just with everyone playing their limitless, having a lot more, well, having no budget restraints. So I was able to have 50 points, but it was a pretty poor game week. Kind of all the people that we were expecting to have big performances didn't. A couple of surprise losses. Obviously, Man United and Arsenal come to mind for a lot of our audience. And yeah, some not frustrating performances. And so it was a good thing that I've came through without wasting the chip. And people can spin that how they want. Some people they say, I'm glad I'm rid of the limitless. It's a bit of a cursed chip. The fact that there's no budget restraints makes it harder to choose a team. But I don't know when I'm going to play that yet. But I think it's good having that in reserve. And I think all I need to do is make up like 15 points more than other people to have the chip pay off holding it. If I don't make that time up, then maybe the limitless was better in match day 2. But still having both chips at this stage while everyone else has used their limitless and now forced to use their wild card, I think I'm in a strong position.
Yeah, so of course that is the caveat that comes with the limitless chip, is you really do have to use your wild card in match day 3 because your match day 1 team is probably quite far away from what is optimal for match day 3. So 50 points it was for match day 2. How did that compare to everybody else? It sounds like for the most part there was enough disappointing performances that probably didn't leave you lingering too far back, and yeah, a bit of treading water perhaps, ready to kick on is where you're probably feeling.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that the transfers that I did use, I took out the people who actually got returns. So I took out Cancelo, and the Barcelona defense kept a clean sheet. So out of the two transfers that I did make, which was Gersons, who got a goal disallowed, so that could have paid off, but it didn't. And Arsenal just having an absolute shocker. Um, Cancelo got more points than both of them combined. So that's kind of frustrating, but loads of people with Limitless were able to still have Barcelona defence. So I think the average score, kind of from what I'm seeing, is round about 52, 53. The people that have passed me in like all my mini leagues seem to have about 60 points, so it's not massively ahead of me. And that can be easily made up when hopefully I play my Limitless later on.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it's very similar to the wildcard discussion in FPL at the moment, where if you've still got hold of it and you manage to just about keep track with those who've already played it, then you may end up actually in a stronger position. So, yeah, I mean, a couple of key guys still delivering points for him. I mean, Bellingham getting 14 points is kind of like Haaland getting 8 points in FPL at this point. Everybody's got him. The Haaland captaincy blank, I'm going to imagine, was a bit frustrating, though. Expecting more
Yeah,
there.
Harry Kane and Haaland blanking, and even if people pick Sane, they blanked as well. Uh, yeah, just not great from captaincy shouts. I think a lot of people who did well in the end, including Dan, who I do my podcast with, who's also on the Fantasy Football Scout. He's on the Champions League podcast there. He ended up going without Haaland, massive risk, but ended up as a result captain in a Barcelona defender. So I think that a few people who did punt on their captain, either captain in Bellingham or captain in, say, a Barcelona defender, ended up doing really well.
Yeah, it's nice to see differential captains come off. As we always say, if you're still new to this game this year, you're probably finding the fact that you can kind of be a bit more risky with some of your substitutions and your captaincies is certainly quite fun. Although I'm probably saying it to the wrong person, bearing in mind the Haaland captaincy. But certainly knowing that the opportunity is there is always part of the appeal of this game. And of course, you have your Tuesday games, you have your Wednesday games, and there's different ways that you can sort of game that by giving those Tuesday players a first chance and use your Wednesday players to come and rescue you. So with that in mind, let's move on to the fixtures for match day 3 and have a look at some of the ones that you've kind of got your eye on as potential opportunities for people to capitalise. So we'll start with Tuesday. So we've got Galatasaray hosting Bayern Munich. We've got Inter Milan versus Salzburg, Man United at home against Copenhagen, Sevilla against Arsenal, Lens against PSV, Braga against Real Madrid, Union Berlin against Napoli, and Benfica against Real Sociedad. So as ever with the Champions League, it's a case of trying to find the biggest gap between the best opponent and the worst opponent in a particular game, and it quite often comes when you've got a top seed against a not so top seed. So yeah, are there any of those particular matchups that stand out on Tuesday night?
I think the two early fixtures, Galatasaray versus Bayern Munich and Inter Salzburg, we get to see the lineups before the deadline. So just a reminder for people in case they need it that the deadline is right at kickoff, so 6:15 UK time. I think that we'll be able to see which Bayern Munich attackers are starting. I potentially wouldn't go the defenders, but that may change based on the Icardi injury that happened over the weekend. And then into Salzburg, I think a lot of people with Inter at home are going to pile in on their defence. I think they do have the best goalkeeper for the second day, Sommer. So if you don't have him yet, I probably jinxed him, so apologies. But I think I think a good strategy that's worked out in the past is going really, really differential and attacking on the first day. So I think a lot of people will captain Harry Kane, especially based on his goals on the weekend, or Leroy Sané. But there's a lot of kind of high risk, high reward um, for Inter wing backs, DeMarco and Dumfries. Dumfries didn't start on the weekend, but he came off the bench and got an assist. We know what a tank and what an unbelievable asset he is for those that have played Euro Fantasy. And at 5.5, that could be a very differential captain. So you could go safe with Harry Kane or could go Dumfries. But in terms of the other fixtures, Braga, they're quite high, they're deceivingly high scoring in the Portuguese league. So Real Madrid defenders might not be the best pick there, but that's definitely a fixture for example, Bellingham. And the discussion on whether we bring back Vinicius Jr., who is the highest scoring player last season. Obviously, he played match day 2 to a surprise for all of us and ended up scoring. So again, his value is kind of diminished now, though, because he is listed as a forward instead of a midfielder. But then, obviously, with Man United at home to Copenhagen, I do think that potentially Hoyland is a good shout for there as well.
Nice. Yes, definitely some fixtures to target. And of course, you mentioned Kane and DeMarco as possible captaincy options, or De Vries or something. Is Bellingham in the conversation for the captaincy as well? I mean, to what extent is effective ownership sort of forcing the hand here? So for those who don't necessarily understand the expression or haven't heard it before, in FPL, if you've got someone who everyone is captaining, their effective ownership tends to double in your rank bracket, because effectively most people in your bracket have him twice because he's getting double points. And so to what extent is that impacting UCL in the same way that Haaland has in the last year impacted FPL? Is it creating that fear just because of how widely owned he is and how well he's doing?
With Bellingham, I'm not sure what his ownership is at the moment. Currently it's 78%, but that won't take into account people who have him on limitless. If anybody is limitless this match day, I think with Bellingham as well, the biggest risk is that people will then, if it doesn't pay off, will switch captains to one of the Man City players the next day. And so it's essentially a battle of Bellingham versus a match day 2 captain. So is it better for you to captain, um, for example, someone who has a home fixture on the Wednesday, uh, who's potentially a good shout, which we'll touch on later, or but to answer your question, basically it's Bellingham versus a match day 2 captain. The Tuesday fixture, I think, help to kind of go a little bit of a risk. You can really go differential and try and just obviously maximize the points, but try and go against the grain a little bit, knowing that on the second day you can kind of go with the crowd. That's kind of the strategy that I use. Who's the most differential captain on the first day, and then I'll just go with the crowd on the second because it hasn't paid off.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So basically, if Real Madrid were playing on Wednesday, then it might actually create more of a fear factor around that captaincy. But as it's a Tuesday game, less so. Okay, yeah. Thank you for enlightening me. As I always say on these, I've not actually played UCL Fantasy before. I played the Euro games and I played the World Cup games, so I know how the structure works. But the very specifics of the players, we leave that up to Aaron, and that's why we have him here. Yeah, thank you very much for answering that question. But let's move on to those all important Wednesday fixtures then, where we're going to find some hopefully more reliable assets or safe options to bail us out if something goes wrong on Tuesday. So Feyenoord are hosting Lazio, Barcelona host Shakhtar Donetsk, Celtic are hosting Atletico Madrid, AC Milan go to PSG, two teams that have who really understand how Newcastle play now, and of course the Magpies are hosting Dortmund, currently top of the group, incredible stuff. Leipzig against Red Star Belgrade, Young Boys hosting Man City, and FC Porto travel to Antwerp. So some big games here. You're probably dying to talk about Newcastle versus Dortmund, but let's segue this slightly more seamlessly and continue to just talk about the captaincy options who could be the fallback if your riskier pick on Tuesday doesn't quite work. My guess is eyes are probably on Man City and maybe Barcelona.
Yeah, Barcelona. The only issue with Barcelona is we will know the lineups before we have to lock in our substitutions and captain changes, but we won't know the full extent. There's a few injuries. Lewandowski's injured, for example, and a couple of other starters, and in their defence. So the risk for them goes up quite a bit. Shakhtar, they are a regular Champions League team, so it's not like the whipping boys or anything like that. They do normally perform. Like they beat Real Madrid in Madrid a few years ago, so they are. I don't think they're a team that we can potentially maximize for captain, but Cancelo is obviously a shout for those that want to maximize the two different avenues for points. In terms of captaincy, obviously Man City. I think the biggest debate for Man City is there's a lot of more players fit now. So we've got Bernardo Silva, Grealish, all that Foden, and we don't know who's going to be the starting players. So late Wednesday is a bit of a nightmare. It'll be better when they're the Tuesday fixtures in match day 4 and when they're in at home. The biggest debate with them as well in terms of captaincy, which I'm sure it is in FPL as well, is Alvarez versus Haaland. Alvarez obviously keeping up with Haaland at the moment, and he's only 7.1 million. He probably will get a price rise this match day too. So the price rises work differently in this game. I'm not sure if you're aware, where the price rises happen after the deadline, so it's not fluid throughout the week, and it's based on performances from the match day earlier. So as soon as the match day 2 deadline locked in, anybody who performed really well on match day 1 got a price rise by zero point 0.1. So people who performed well in match day 1 and 2 are guaranteed a price rise this time. So Alvarez could potentially go up to 7.2, 7.3, which is still very cheap on this game. Haaland obviously is the safer captain shout. He is back to goal scoring form thanks to the international break. He scored again on the weekend. Um, but I don't think you can look past many more. Obviously, Leipzig against Red Star Belgrade. It's the easiest way to say that team. Um, yeah, they have a good few shouts in terms of Donny Olmo being back, and just they've got a really good attacking outlets, both in attack and defense. And then I think they're kind of the biggest teams for the captaincy shout.
Nice. And unfortunately, Newcastle not quite making that conversation. But reason to be really enjoying European football this year. And I guess how much do we read into the PSG result, both as a fan, but also for your UCL Fantasy selections as well?
Yeah, so I unfortunately had Botman in my team, the only defender not to play and is still injured. Um, Dan Burn, I guess the good news is that Botman has went up in price based on the Milan match. Dan Burn went up in price because of the Milan match, but Fabian Shaw didn't. So he's 4.5, and he will be guaranteed a price rise based on his goal and unbelievable performance against Paris Saint-Germain. Dan Burn will be going up in price again, so he'll probably be 4.7 million. Um, but again, how much can you? I guess the thing with the Newcastle defenders, because they're so cheap, is they just have to outscore whoever didn't perform on match day 1. As I keep saying, match day 1, Tuesday games. So many different terms in terms of FPL, but who didn't perform on the Tuesday. So, for example, if I went for an Arsenal player or an Inter player, Napoli player, and they didn't perform, I would just need my Newcastle player to potentially get 4 or 5 points, which they could easily do with ball recoveries, especially against Dortmund. So I'm not expecting them to score loads again. Um, I think that was just, I think that was more so Paris Saint-Germain not doing their homework and not doing due diligence. So, but if you want a defender who's going to guarantee a price rise and just has to outscore your uh, Tuesday game defenders, I think Newcastle are a good shout. But so is a couple of other players, for example, what I mentioned with Leipzig and stuff like that.
Nice. And in terms of the Newcastle attack, is it still too difficult to predict, or can we rely on perhaps a Gordon or an Isak or something like that?
So I think the biggest thing with this game is that Gordon is 5.5, so he's dirt cheap. And then with kind of all the other players as well, they're like 6.5, so they're a whole million more for like Bruno and Tonali, and well, Tonali's 6, but we don't know what's happening with that situation. Joe Linton's 6.5, and both Callum Wilson and Isak are 7.5. So Gordon, having put in loads of player of the match worthy performances, which remember you do get points for in this game as well. Being at home against Dortmund, 5.5, which is normally like defensive midfielder status, I think Gordon is a good shout. We just need to confirm that he's not injured because there might be a rumour of that when he got brought off against Crystal Palace.
Yeah, as ever, it's always worth keeping an eye on those press conferences. And obviously, mentioned Botman as well. The latest we got on him is that he's probably going to be out for a couple of weeks, for example, which Eddie Howe chose not to reveal before the FPL deadline and chose to reveal it afterwards. So, cheers, Eddie. We really appreciate that. So maybe he might not actually be as forthcoming as we need him to be in those press conferences, but certainly worth keeping an eye. Let's move quickly on then to sort of how you're set up for match day 3. Although what I've got on the screen at the moment is the season ticker, and the reason I've stuck that on there, fantastic season ticket that FPL Reactions has done for us this season for UCL Fantasy, is very much to sort of pinpoint where you think your chips are going. And, you know, there will be other people out there who didn't use the limitless chip in match day 2. So looking at the remaining fixtures, of course, match days 3 and 4 are flipped. So you get 2 matches in a row of, you know, if you've got a good matchup in match day 3, you've also got a good matchup in match day 4. Those are sort of the fixture considerations. What impact is that having on where you're thinking about putting your chips in your diary?
So I'm leaning more towards playing the wild card for this match day, simply because of I can target match day 3 and 4. Obviously, you've mentioned that the same, and I think a lot of people are doing that anyways. But also in terms of match day 5, I can potentially start to move some of the players. I have a bit of a head start in moving some of the players to that way. A lot of people looked at the exact same fixtures in match day 5. The only difference is that the better teams are at home. So Man City are at home, Paris Saint-Germain are at home, Bayern Munich are at home, Arsenal are at home. And based on how the results have been going, I think the only people who are potentially going to definitely qualify by this point are potentially going to be Man City and not Paris Saint-Germain, because they played awfully against us. Uh, Man City and Bayern Munich. And so they're the only teams I have to really worry about in terms of rotation, but they also play on the Tuesday, and Bayern Munich have the early kickoff on the Wednesday. So I think that's like that's kind of my thinking, and I've still got the limitless held in reserve. So that's kind of what I'm debating at the moment. Um, but leaning towards the wild card. So when you pull up my team, it is not going to be a -20.
Yeah, so I've just stuck that on the screen now with that glorious -20 up the top. I make it, I think, 7 changes. So yeah, talk us through you're thinking it, and I do notice, of course, one Anthony Gordon, who you've already spoken about, but yeah, it sticks out obviously. So many Newcastle fans involved in UCL fantasy coverage this year. I love it.
We've kind of came out of nowhere, haven't we? But I think kind of going on the goalkeepers first of all. So Sommer, like I said, he's the early goalkeeper, and I do think he's just the best on that day. Inter are a really good defensive unit. And Blaswich, who are going to be playing Red Star Belgrade 2 games in a row. And I think that he's also a really good option. You could go for a cheaper goalkeeper on that second day, which they talk about more on the podcast. So definitely give that a listen. Um, the and then I've decided to double up on Inter because I think everybody's going to go Inter. So having just one player is potentially not going to be a massive advantage. Um, you're just going to be covering the same points as everyone else. So I've went Dumfries based on what I was saying before, and he's a potential captaincy shout depending on how brave I feel at the time. Cancelo, Henriks, Savic, and Ake. Ake did not play. Well, he came off the bench for Man City on the weekend, but I do believe he'll start. And he's only 4.5 million, and so I think he's a great shout. Potentially might play at left back. We don't know yet. Bellingham, of course, he's not going anywhere. Anthony Gordon, Sane. Anthony Gordon, kind of what I said before, 5.5. There's not really many better attacking options for that price point. Turam, he scored again on the weekend for 6.5, out of position. I think he's a great player. So triple Inter, which for someone who watched a lot of AC Milan growing up, I think that's quite offensive, but apologies to all the AC Milan fans. And Danny Olmo coming back. That could be Xavi Simons. I don't know how I feel about the triple RB Leipzig, but as you can see, I've got 1 million in the bank. That could be upgraded to kind of move Olmo around. But I think Olmo is the best player on that team. I remember earlier in the season, he single-handedly beat Bayern Munich in the cup. So yeah, I think it's great that he's back fit, just in terms of how good of a player he is and how he benefits that team. Strikers, Harry Kane and Haaland stay in the team. I've taken out Mbappe for Jimenez for Feyenoord. He's 1% owned at the moment, and Lazio, he's playing Lazio at home, who aren't playing very good. He's kind of my differential pick because he scored one goal on the weekend. He scored two before that, and he's on penalties. I think he's on a really good goal scoring form. He scores in most games that Feyenoord play. He was suspended for the first few games of the Champions League because of a red card that he picked up last season in the Europa League, I believe. So he's back at home against Lazio, who are 12th, I think, in Serie A. Yeah, yeah, I'm quite excited for him. Watch it not work out, but I really hope that it does.
Yeah, no, it's a good way to go, certainly. And well, you made a compelling case for me as someone who doesn't actually have a team, so you can at least take some solace in that. I mean, in terms of how the team is set up and your decision making is obviously we're recording this on Monday. Got just over a day basically until you got to settle this. How settled are you? I mean, you've mentioned a couple of the 50-50s there, but you fairly confident your wild card.
Yeah, I just think in terms of if I look at my match day two team again, the players I would definitely want out is Tchouaméni against Braga. Uh, Normally, Real Madrid defensive midfielders pick up at least 5 or 6 points, but I think it's more of a dual, like it's more of a combined effort rather than just being solely anchored on Casemiro now. And so I think rather than the 5 and 6 points that a defensive midfielder normally got, it's shared between Camavinga, Bellingham, Tchouaméni. So it's only been 3 points. So I'd want rid of him. Mbappe is just too much money at the moment, and Paris Saint-Germain are not playing great. Against AC Milan, who have kept 2 clean sheets so far in the Champions League, I think that we can't read too much into the league performances because they've picked up loads of red cards. So Theo Hernandez and Mignan, the goalkeeper, were suspended, and then Thiaw he got red carded. So we can't read too much into the league. But when they have the full strength start defense, they're quite solid. And Paris Saint Germain couldn't. Well, they broke down Newcastle once, great goal, but I don't think they're going to have a lot of room for Mbappe to operate. He doesn't need a lot of room, but he's probably going to only get me one goal, is what I'm thinking. So that's not enough for 11.5 million when I could, again, go to Jimenez. Saliba as well and Gersons I probably wouldn't want. So they're players that I don't want in my team, and everyone else is wild carding. So I think like although I don't want everyone else to influence my decisions, I think it needs to do in order for me to have a good rank later on and for that limitless to not put as much pressure on the limitless when I do play it, so that I'm not trying to make up more ground than I need to.
Yeah, and then just put the season ticket back on the screen as well. I mean, we've come out of a game week or match day, I should say, where lots of the teams you'd want to be invested in had harder fixtures. A lot of those teams now have better fixtures. You now got to run a games where you can have that run twice. If you've got significant number of players you don't want, that's when you wild card, to be honest. So it does make a lot of sense. Well, thank you very much, Aaron, for talking us through your team there. And yeah, if you want to see how Aaron's team looks at the very passing of the deadline, then of course you can go and find him on social media as well at Aaron Graydon, or Aaron_Graydon, I should say, on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it these days. I'm sure the platform will have a new name at some point. So yeah, go and seek him out there if you want some more advice and if you want to see how his team gets on. Now, we haven't actually looked at anything from the Fantasy Football Scout members area on this particular video. But if you find that information useful for your FPL team, of course, don't forget that time is running out to get your 30% off on that. So make sure you've signed up for that as well. And of course, one last plug, of course, for the UCL Fantasy Pod, which you can find on social media at Fantasy UCL Pod or just on any of the podcast platforms that you access fantasy football community on. So make sure you go check them out. That's everything I need to add in terms of housekeeping, Aaron, unless there's anything else you'd like to get in before we finish.
No, I think we've covered pretty much a lot, but just that podcast again. Obviously, the co-host that I've got on my personal podcast with Dan, he got he has a lot better history on it, and he goes into a lot more detail on a couple of these points. So definitely give the podcast a listen. It's a massive help.
Yeah, it's very, very good. So yeah, well, thank you for the additional plug. If you've had 2 plugs now, guys, and if you still haven't gone and sort them out, then well, that's a you problem. So yeah, but with that, we shall leave you fine folks to enjoy the rest of your planning for match day 2, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.